Mr. Branden, how do you account for the fact that many defenders of capitalism approve of military conscription?
Well, the first thing you have to remember that just because a person professes a belief in capitalism does not mean that he is a consistent defender of complete, total, laissez-faire capitalism. In fact, probably the majority of alleged defenders of capitalism today do not believe in full laissez-faire. And that means that they are not actually consistent advocates of the principle of inalienable individual rights. They may profess a belief in rights in certain contexts, and in other contexts see nothing wrong with the government violating rights. For example, I dare say there are many advocates of capitalism, or rather people who would so describe themselves, who also believe in protective tariffs, which is an idea completely incompatible with laissez-faire capitalism, because complete laissez-faire capitalism has to rest logically and morally and philosophically on the inviolability of individual rights. And that entails, as a necessary collateral factor, the complete separation of state and economics. So, for example, a government which has no right to interfere into men's economic activities would have no right to establish protective tariffs. And so the same inconsistencies will permit many so-called conservatives to be all in favor of the draft, because a great many conservatives, just like a great many liberals, are really authoritarian in many ways. They have contradictions in their beliefs. And I think one of the most contemptible things you will sometimes see among these alleged defenders of free enterprise is people who are very, very strong on the importance of property rights, but who see nothing wrong with the government drafting people to go and fight and possibly die. Now, as you all know, I'm certainly a defender of property rights, but I'll be damned if I see why they are more important than the right of life itself. Rights are indivisible. You are in a hopeless contradiction if you try to argue that you believe in property rights, you believe in freedom of the press or freedom of speech or what have you. You believe in every other kind of freedom, except you don't believe a person is the moral owner of his own life. That's the contradiction which many advocates of capitalism are guilty of, and that is the kind of sloppy philosophical thinking which in part accounts for the failure of the advocates of capitalism to win their intellectual battle, at least their failure to date.
What is your opinion of the trend among certain alleged defenders of free enterprise to repudiate the concept of government entirely and to advocate instead some form of what amounts to anarchy?
Well, let me say at the outset that I, of course, am an advocate of limited constitutional government. I am in complete agreement with Ayn Rand's essay on the nature of government, which appeared both in her collection of essays, The Virtue of Selfishness, and was reprinted again in her later book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. Therefore, I'm not going to here review the arguments for the necessity of a constitutional form of government, since I assume you're all familiar with it and in fact agree with me on that subject. I think it's a very unfortunate trend which is seducing an awful lot of somewhat careless thinkers. This trend among alleged libertarians to advocate what you correctly call anarchism. I think the motives differ from person to person. I think the motives of the people who cooked up this idea are not necessarily the same as the motives of everybody who is fooled or seduced by their arguments. I think they do a very serious disservice to the cause of free enterprise because they put forth a position which is so palpably ridiculous that they just make their own contribution to placing the advocacy of capitalism in the category of the lunatic fringe. And that's very unfortunate, because some of the people associated with the anarcho-capitalist movement are not stupid. They can be very intelligent, they can be very articulate, many, and they do a real disservice to the cause of rational capitalism. I think this is a movement that will have a brief vogue and that will die in a few years, because as people have a chance to mature and to think the matter over, I think they are going to realize that the arguments they have accepted are very spurious, and they may look back with some degree of embarrassment upon this period of their intellectual development. I don't think the whole issue is of great social or sociological significance. I think it's an unfortunate phase. I think it will pass. And I really have to say, I think it's all pretty stupid.
Well then, Mr. Branden, how would you answer the argument of these anarchists that since government necessarily entails a monopoly on the use of force, such a monopoly can be maintained only by force, and hence government always involves some violation of individual rights?
This, of course, is their favorite argument and their stock argument, and in briefest essentials, I would answer it as follows. Let's imagine, to make it very simple, that we, this group in this room tonight, form a society. We agree upon the principles to be operative in this society in the political sense. We agree upon a constitution, and the government is created for the purpose of carrying out the principles laid down in the Constitution. Now, let us say that somebody new is born into this society or enters it from some other country. And he says, look, I wasn't consulted, I wasn't asked my opinion about this system of government. I want to set up a competing system of government. How can you justify forbidding me to do so and threatening me with jail if I don't go along with the present political order of things? And my answer is the following. Remember, we are talking here about a free system, about a government which is limited in its function to the protection of individual rights. Now suppose that I am the spokesman for this hypothetical government. Then I would say to this person as follows. In this society, nobody is forbidding you anything, so long as you do not violate the rights of anybody else in the society. That means more specifically, if you want to form private arbitration agencies to settle disputes among people who will become your clients, you may do so. That happens even in our present society. You can form a private club or a private organization and lay down any kind of rules you want for your members. You will not be stopped until and unless you attempt to use physical force or fraud or some derivative against some fellow member of the society, because that you have no right to do. If you ever attempt to use force, let us say, in retaliation against a criminal, which you may have to do if a policeman is not available, you will be obliged to justify later your use of force and to demonstrate that in fact it was necessary. If you can justify it, you're in no trouble, any more than any other citizen of a free country is in trouble. So that so long as you do not infringe anybody else's rights, you can form any kind of organization you want, you can have your own arbitration committees, you can have your own kind of system of penalties and fines, and so long as the people who go along with your organization voluntarily agree to pay them, you have no problem. Your problem begins when you attempt to use force to get your way. Therefore, in conclusion, I argue, in the system we are advocating, the individual is not having his rights violated because he is not allowed to set up a competing government.